everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel conversation about Black homelessness. We are going to wait a couple of minutes to let the room fill up, and then we'll get started. Hello, everyone who's just joined us. I'm Catherine Bracey. I'm the founder and executive director of the Tech Equity Collaborative. Thank you for joining us for this panel conversation about Black homelessness. We are just giving folks a few minutes to fill up the room, and we will get started in just a moment. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this conversation about Black homelessness. I'm Catherine Bracey. I'm the founder and executive director of the Tech Equity Collaborative. We are going to giving folks a few minutes to fill in the room, and we will get started in just a minute. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, for those of you who just joined us, I am Catherine Bracey. I'm the founder and executive director of the Tech Equity Collaborative. I want to thank you all for joining us for this really important conversation about Black homelessness. Before I introduce our panelists, just a quick update or little background for those of you who aren't familiar with Tech Equity and what we do. We are mobilizing tech workers and tech companies around issues that we think will make it so that as the tech economy grows, more people benefit from that growth. So we do three things. We educate tech workers and companies about the issues that we work on, do events like this and other forms of education. We do a lot of policy advocacy to push an agenda that we think will make a growing tech economy benefit more people. And we connect tech workers and companies to the communities where they are based. We work on two main issues, obviously housing, which is going to be a topic of conversation today, and also workforce and labor. And we also do approach this work with a racial equity lens to understand how the legacy of racism is really built into inequities in our economy. So I'm really excited to be having this conversation with a really great set of panelists. We are going to start with Joy Moses, who is this is a mouthful, Director of the National Alliance to End Homelessness Research Institute, and is based in DC. We usually have California-based panelists on our webinar, so we're really glad to have you join us from the other side of the country. Joy, I'm wondering if you can just help us set the context for this conversation. What is the extent of the Black homelessness crisis? where and how do we see this issue play out? And why are Black people disproportionately represented in the homeless population more than other groups?
I did prepare a few slides, so I'm going to go ahead and share them so I can go over some of that information. Let me just get us started here. So I wanted to highlight a couple of statistics to start this conversation about I guess the depths of the disparities between Black people and others in the United States. So on the left here is the breakdown of the homelessness population by racial ethnic group. As you can see, the longest bar belongs to white people. So white people are the majority of people experiencing homelessness, followed by people who are Black, and the next sizable group is Hispanics. But that doesn't tell us everything we need to know. We like to take a look at the representation according to population of each group. So we look at how many people are experiencing homelessness amongst each group per 10,000. And when you approach the data that way, you can see that Black people have the longest line. Sorry, let me go back. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Oops. You can see that the line for Black people is the longest, with 55 out of every 10,000 experiencing homelessness, and that is far greater than any of the other groups. One of the things that, sorry again. I'm just not having the greatest luck with slides today. Please don't take this out against other people from outside of the Bay Area and outside of the tech world. We often like to look at homelessness from the perspective of different regions. And so the service providers are basically divided according to what we call continuums of care. There's about 400 of them across the country, and they have divided up America largely based on county lines, but there's a mixture of ways in which they are defined. And when we look at the COCs, we have noticed that there are Black people who are homeless in just about all of them, 98% of them. Even though as a group, we're a small part of the population, only 13%. Overrepresentation within homelessness exists in every state of the union and Washington, D.C. as well. And the majority, Black people are the majority of people experiencing homelessness in 12 states in the District of Columbia. So the worst numbers, they tend to exist in the Northeast, the West, the major cities. The absolute highest rate of homelessness for Black people in the country is in New York, with a rate of 210 people out of every 10,000. That ties with the state of Maine, which is interesting because it's so different than the other ones that tend to be in the top, and closely followed by California, which has 194 Black people experiencing homelessness out of 10,000. So I won't go over the list of suspects too deeply because I think we're all familiar with the history of racism and discrimination and how it affects so many areas of life, including homelessness. And to a great extent, homelessness becomes the place where everything else failed. When all the other societal systems fail is where people tend to end up. It's the system of last resort. Often within our work, we talk about the criminal justice and child welfare systems because we see such an over-representation of Black people in those systems, and then they often they disproportionately end up in homelessness. But there's a couple of other issues that I want to raise about why we see the disparities in Black homelessness. There's definitely an issue related to families with children. More than a lot of the other groups, families with children are a big part of the homelessness story. They are 40% of Black homelessness, and that's compared to another major group like white Americans where they're only 22%. So the numbers were so high that we wanted to see what it would be like if families had the same access to housing as their white counterparts. And we noted that it would cause the rate of homelessness to drop by more than 10 points if we just made sure that we had enough families in adequate housing. So this is something, the whole lack of housing issue has, family housing issue has come up in a number of places in recent years. One of the most famous ones is Matthew Desmond's book Evicted, where he talked about basically a number of Black women and their children who are facing a constant string of evictions. That's something that we are well familiar with in our work. It's showing up in the homelessness space. The reasons for that are the two big ones are that the government destroyed a lot of its public housing in the name of rehabbing it a couple decades ago, but never replaced all of it. So there's been substantial losses in the amount of public housing units available. And then the second thing is that it's just not enough housing being built to keep up with the demand, especially in major urban areas and places where there's high concentrations of people, like in the San Francisco Bay Area, where jobs have been growing within this 7-year period, 2010 to 2017, 500,000 jobs were added, but only 100,000 new housing units. And this is something that we're seeing in a lot of urban areas. But there's also a big story, obviously, around individuals. These individuals tend to be the ones who are most visible within homelessness. They are the other 60% of Black homelessness. And they face some significant challenges. When you're talking about Black men, oftentimes there's limited public sympathy for their needs. Some of them have criminal records, inconsistent employment, and mental health issues that have been unaddressed. These issues can be difficult to overcome when you're trying to get aid to people and meaningfully change their situations. There's also limited access to the social safety net. Much of what the United States and many state and local governments put together as far as programs and aid is often directed towards women with children, with limited avenues for people who are just single adults living on their own. During the same periods where we had a disappearance of public housing, we also had a disappearance of what we call SROs, which are single room occupancy units. At one time in our country, there was a lot more places where if you were a single adult, you could get a room and maybe a bathroom or a shared bathroom, and you would have a place to stay. Those places have largely disappeared, likely connected to concerns about NIMBYism. Adult men who were unconnected to families were not exactly a group of people that neighbors wanted living near them. And then when you add to it that a lot of them may be Black or men of color, it was a challenge. And so a lot of the units were torn down and never replaced. Another issue that we discuss a lot is older adults. A big part of the homelessness problem at this point is older adults. Their numbers are growing within the population. Over the next 10 years, there are projections that the group will grow 2.5 to 3 times as large as it is now. That is tied to what is called a cohort effect. Essentially, the folks who are aging and are in their 50s to early 60s now came of age during the early 1980s, and they entered the job market during a period of recession, and did not have the jobs that they should have had at the beginning of their work lives. And it particularly affected African American people who were at some points had as high as 25% unemployment among youth. And what we found is that there's some people who've been struggling since youth in and out of homelessness, and some who have just generally struggled economically all of their lives, and they had been housing stable, but because they've been on the brink are now entering homelessness for the first time. I wanted to mention a little bit about the services that are provided. So the biggest one is if you actually, as a homeless services system, provide people with shelter. One of the things that we know is that our homeless services system substantially does that for Black Americans. We are the group that's most likely to be in shelter. This chart on the right shows the comparisons between the comparisons amongst the groups. This is framed in terms of unsheltered. So Black people have the lowest unsheltered homelessness rate of only 25%. Sometimes I think there's a tendency to put a question mark behind that and say, well, I guess this is a group of people who is overly taking advantage of services, but that really isn't the case. The use of shelters roughly matches the percentage of people in the homeless population. So 42% of the people in shelter are Black, and 40% of the people who are homeless are Black. The real issue is that there are a lot of people in the other groups who are underutilizing shelter, while Black people are utilizing shelter at about their representation within the population. So I wanted to end there. I didn't want to go on too long, but I have put my contact information on the screen, and I'm sure to be available through Tech Equity. Be happy to participate in the discussion later on.
Yeah, and we will send this contact info in a follow-up email. And if I encourage everyone to go to your website, the National Alliance to End Homelessness website, there's a ton of great resources there. You know, I hope we can come back to some of this in the broader discussion. Also, speaking of which, we will be taking Q&A at the end. We'll leave about 15 minutes for that. So if you have a question for the panelists, please drop it into the Q&A function, not the chat function. And Megan Abel, who's our Director of Advocacy, will be curating those and kicking questions up to us at the end. But I want to jump to Lorraine Cantley. I mean, Joy gave us just a really great overview of sort of the high level crisis to help ground us in, you know, what the Black homelessness crisis looks like. But you have experienced personally challenges trying to find stable housing. Can you help us understand what this looks? I mean, the thing that we met because I read an article that you were quoted in, and the thing that you said in the article that I found really striking was that you were doing everything right. You were, you know, working. You weren't, you know, in the system. You weren't on, you know, doing drugs. You didn't have a mental health issue, but you were running into all of these barriers to finding stable housing. And eventually, it dawned on you that a lot of these challenges were solely because you were Black. And that really struck me, and I'm wondering if you can just help us understand your personal experience trying to find stable housing and what you would want people to know about how this, you know, plays out on the ground for real people.
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me, and thank you all for choosing to invest your time with this conversation with us. Being born and raised in Los Angeles has been a great, ignition for social justice work in my world. Growing up in the family dynamics where there was lots of instability due to run-ins with the criminal justice system. There was the war on drugs that was released into my community. My dad had many run-ins with the police. There was that intersection of the children's services system. And so there was just so much instability in my childhood growing up. I remember hearing, if you do well in school, then you won't be homeless. And I excelled. I remember being a small child going from the MTA just to get on the yellow school bus, just to get to this school in the valley. And when I would get to this school in the valley, I would see the difference in the peace and the ease that the other children experienced in life. When my experience was, what are things going to be like when I get home? Will there be a home? Fast forward to my own journey to wanting to create this idea of a Cosby living for my children. In 1998, I signed up for housing. And when I was able to, the day after I graduated from high school, I moved out because I thought that I could create a different environment for me and my children to have stability, and realizing that at that time I could not afford the housing alone. So I married. Due to my Christian beliefs, they say if you live together, you should be married. I married my abuser of choice. We had more children, and it led up to the point where due to the abuse, it was like, don't work, don't go to school, don't take the children to the park, don't take out the trash, and matter of fact, don't check the mail. It was just like life was breaking down for me. So as a result of the domestic violence, me and my children became homeless. And from 1998 to 2012, I sat on this list, and then one day my name finally came up. By that time, there was so much that had been accumulated of the traumas and everything that I needed to recover from. So we get this housing, and we're stable in the housing, and I get to the point where I don't need the government assistance. Like, I'm doing this social justice advocacy work, and life is starting to take really great turns for what I believe is possible for me and my children. There's no drug use, there's, mental illness, all this stuff has been addressed and taken care of, and then have a great thing to come along, right? 2 of my children are graduating from high school. One was supposed to graduate the next year, but she decided she wanted to get it over with. 2, they all believe that when you do well in school, then you'll be able to do well in life. That set me back, because for children to graduate, it costs. For you to send them off to college, it costs. And while going through this journey of trying to get them through their senior school year, I lost a client, so that was income drop, and my car broke. So these 3 things created such a challenge for me to stay on top of paying rent. I reached out to my property management, and they said, hey, well, let me know when you figure it out. Next thing you know, I was getting an eviction notice on my door. This is years of being a social justice activist. This is years of recuperation after being homeless. And it was just a huge slap in the face that no matter what I've done to meet these standards of what they say is the American citizen, I was still challenged with that burden of not having the opportunity to save, not having the social safety in the sense of being able to reach out to enough folks and say, hey, my rent is behind, I need some help. Could someone help me with this process of being able to allow my children to be able to enjoy their senior year and go off to college? Could someone help me with the transportation challenge that I'm having? So all these different factors just started to have me explore, what are people facing that have not been in the social justice work, have not been connected to the knowledge that I know based on the fact that I've been partnering with homeless services providers, and I know this certain lingo of the rapid rehousing and the shallow subsidy, and know who to talk to, and yet and still was still lots of barriers there. And so it brings me to this point of understanding. It's not about us being inadequate in our income. That's not the issue. It's not about us being lazy. That's not the issue. It's a known fact that in the HMIS system, which is the homeless, forgetting the terminology right now, but there's a system where people are being entered in that are experiencing homelessness. And they have found out that Black people are entering in the system being the higher income earners. But due to the barriers, they're the highest rates that are facing homelessness. And there's so much to learn about that.
So
I'm still baffled.
from your experience, it sounds like there were multiple points at which, like, if there had just been an easy intervention, a lot of this could have been prevented. And that if you weren't, personally as resilient as you are and had connections because of the advocacy work you were doing, that's a cliff that many people fall off of and have a really hard time coming back from. So, it feels like there might have been points at which an easy and, inexpensive intervention could prevent a lot of pain. Do you see like specific points in your process where if that had happened, it could have really made a huge difference?
Yes. So from the first moment of me feeling that impact of great news, your daughter's graduating early, and then me talking with the school and letting them know, hey, so I'm a single mom, this is my income, what are the supports for families like this so that my child gets to experience her senior year just like anyone else? That wasn't helpful. Then there was the call to my property management and saying to them, this is what's showing up for me. I lost a client. My rent is this much. I have this issue going on with my transportation. I have this going on with the children graduating. And the property management responding with, well, let us know when you figure it out. I think that if people communicate with their property management what their challenges are, that should be a point where they're stabilized, where there's property management is informed with prevention methods right away. So whatever it is, you've brought to us what the concerns are, and here are the resources. We have this growing opportunity for partnering and co-creating. And so understanding that relationship between property management and between the homeless services and between the dollars that are addressing homelessness and prevention of homelessness could have really helped in that process to where the stress of getting that event could have been eliminated. The other thing is how Black children aren't being supported in being able to go to college. There's many times my children sat in many workshops filling out many of these applications for scholarships, yet and still my son went off to Humboldt State. He was not supported at all. Not only not supported with scholarship funding, but due to racial discrimination, he was like, Mom, I don't know how to do this. I can't do it. I'm coming home.
Yeah, you have highlighted some really, taken what Joy laid out as sort of the larger context and really highlighted how people experience this and what the real human pain and cost is of us not dealing with these issues. And, for you, John Jones, who's the campaign director for the Alameda County Fair Chance Housing Coalition, which Tech Equity is an ally partner with, you have personal experience with this issue from another angle, which is that you've interacted with the criminal justice system in the past. And that, as Joy mentioned, has presented unique challenges for, Black people, but specifically Black men in accessing housing. And I think especially in this moment where a lot of people are sort of newly woken up to, the racial injustice in the criminal justice system, but don't really, or maybe aren't yet woken up to how that bias continues once you're out, and how that can create all kinds of barriers to entry to the economy, and just restabilizing yourself with your family. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that issue, specifically the intersection between homelessness and the criminal justice system, particularly for Black men, but also a little bit about your own personal story, because I know it has a very happy ending, and we saw Josiah back there running around. I'm hoping he'll make another cameo. So over to you.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Jones III. In addition to being a campaign manager for the Alameda County Fair Chance Housing campaign, I'm also on staff with Just Cities, where I serve as the Director of Community and Political Engagement. I want to start by sharing something I always say. There's only one place in America any one of us is guaranteed a roof over our head, and that is in prison. And when we think about housing and you think about incarceration, both of these things form the cornerstone of America. What I mean by that is the concept of private property. A lot of people don't know when you go to prison, you are legally and officially declared property of the state. The state has a legal obligation to provide housing for us. The same thing doesn't hold true once we're released into the quote unquote free world. So for myself, I paroled in July 2012, and I served time in prison out of state. When I came back to Oakland, this was at the early onset of displacement and gentrification. And I think it's important by way of context for folks to understand that Oakland was a city that, first of all, landlords were not conducting criminal background checks. Number two, Oakland was a city that if you were evicted on a Monday, you can find a place to live by Wednesday. These things dramatically changed as gentrification began to develop and take full swing. So it was interesting because for me personally, the first 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, I experienced housing instability in pretty much every aspect. From couch surfing to sleeping in cars. There have been a couple of times I slept at the BART station outside. I spent 9 months in a shady motel that the city of Oakland was trying to close due to sex trafficking and violence. There was a point in time where I stayed with my youngest son, Josiah, his mother. I was not able to be added to the lease. We ended up being evicted because when the property owner realized that he can get pretty much quadruple the rent, we were late 1 month. I took out a payday loan to give him the money, and he refused to accept it. And we didn't really know our rights as tenants then. So to be displaced, having kids. And I'm a single father. I have an 18-year-old now, and my youngest son is Josiah, 5. One thing I learned and realized about this is there is a clear intersection when we're talking about the housing crisis and mass incarceration. Both were formed by policies. Legislation created both. And if you look at Oakland specifically, we have to keep in mind that in 1940, Oakland was 95% white, 2.9% Black. Due to World War II, so many people moved to Oakland. My grandfather, who I'm named after, being one, for employment. Once the war was over and Black people stayed in Oakland, the city leadership began to devise means and mechanisms to either keep Black people confined to the worst areas of Oakland, which denied them the opportunity to build generational wealth through home ownership. And if you go through the Black Panthers, keeping in mind, this is where the Black Panthers started. And COINTELPRO was aimed at destroying and disrupting not just the Panthers, but the Black community. That created the influx of drugs and guns, which led to all these mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. And then the associated attachments, what we call the collateral impact of a record, preventing people from living in public housing, private housing, from accessing jobs. Then when you get to 2008, where we had the housing crisis or the housing crash, that was so key because a lot of Black people, in this situation, particular Black women, who lost their sweat equity through these predatory lending practices. All of the things contribute to what we're seeing now. So the point about having a record, this is where it really got crucial. It wasn't a clear process. That's what I mean by that. You have an application, you fill it out. I've experienced this. I applied for an apartment. I had asked the property manager, do you conduct a criminal background check? He told me no. He said, in fact, his dad was formerly incarcerated. I said, okay. He gave me the application and had that question on there. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? And the follow-up question is usually, if so, for what? I pointed it out to him. He said, I was unaware of this. He said, it should be no problem. I've never conducted a criminal background check. He's a property manager. He is not the one that does the background check. There is another entity. A lot of people use these third-party entities who conduct criminal background checks. And the data shows that nearly 50% of these background checks contain errors. For example, in my case, they said that I went to prison in 1983. That's impossible because I was 9 years old. So you're not in a position to have recourse. When I tried to appeal, they told me, well, they have to go off what the third-party entity said. So it's all these layers and complex systems that's conspiring to work against folks like myself. So this is when we began to have the campaign to end this discrimination, because effectively that's what it is. You know, when we talk about mass incarceration, we cannot eliminate the racialized aspect, because we know the Black community in particular has been over-policed, which is going to lead to mass incarceration. And it was important to be able to educate people about the historical context. In other words, we wasn't just saying landlords are bad people or this landlord is racist. It's really systems, and sometimes people are unwittingly and unintentionally participating in these systems. So at the end of the day, we were able to get the strongest and first fair chance housing ordinance passed in the state of California that covers both the public and the private housing stock. And I do want to say this before I wrap up. The formerly incarcerated population, just like any other demographic, is not monolithic. There's a tendency to think of people who are formerly incarcerated as uneducated or undereducated as being low income. Decision makers were asking us why we didn't just focus on public housing. I have a job, I make too much, I don't qualify for Section 8. So we also had to make sure that we changed not just the mindset and the understanding of the issues, but putting a human face to it. So as a result, the ordinance passed in Oakland this year in January. It passed in Berkeley in February. Mind you, in a lot of ways, it was prophetic because this was before the onset of COVID-19 and the increased number of folks who are contracting the virus inside. That's led to the release of many people coming home. And for those who reside in the cities of Berkeley and Oakland, they're going to have an opportunity to access housing, whether it's independently or living with a loved one. And mind you, under COVID and shelter in place, my family was able to move into this beautiful new home right here in East Oakland as a result of this ordinance passing. And I want to just share this last piece because it was just so interesting. We baked into the ordinance a 6-month grace period because we were not adversarial toward landlords. We wanted to provide sufficient time for them to not only understand the ordinance, but to make the necessary changes, including removing languages from the advertisements and the application. When I applied for this unit here, it had the question about felonies on the application. I've learned you have to be honest, so I marked yes, and then when it said for what, I wrote in Oakland Fair Chance Housing Ordinance. There was a follow-up question asking, am I willing to consent to a background check? I put no. So when I turned the application in, I was somewhat nervous because I'm expecting the property owner to say, hey, John, why you wrote this? That didn't happen. Not only did we get the unit, but later on, she shared with me that she was familiar with some of the housing work that we do. So it just goes to show how it's just so much a blessing in this time. And I'm just always mindful and grounded in this moment that had I paroled in this moment with COVID, I don't know what the situation would have been for me. So I'm so grateful for everyone who worked on this, and especially the Tech Equity Collaborative, because at the end of the day, it's going to take all of us to change this truly dehumanizing and egregious practice of keeping people from accessing something that we all, for the most part, agree is a human right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad to end on that, not least because it has a happy ending, and you know, I've seen your pictures on Facebook of your new house, and I'm really jealous of your yard, by the way, as I have none in my 1-bedroom apartment during shelter in place, but so that's great. But it also highlights the importance of policy change and the importance of policy advocacy and really making a difference in people's lives. I mean, this is something that we passed in January. And to your point, like, you were empowered to, you know, let your landlord know. And there were many people who would see that question on the application and just not fill it out beforehand. So it really does make a difference that the policies, obviously we see that the policies that created the bias in the system made a difference. It's important for us to advocate for anti-racist policies as well, because they do work. And so to that point, I would like to have a little bit of a conversation about policy change. So Joy, maybe starting with you, what are sort of the highest priority things we should be thinking about in terms of policy advocacy that could really make a difference in at least fixing the disproportionality of Black homelessness, if not ending homelessness altogether?
Well, in the immediate, we want to try to do our best to make sure that the current crisis doesn't increase the disparities and make things worse. Congress is currently working on the HEROES Act, which has included at various points a couple of things, a moratorium on evictions, but also just plain supplements to keep people in their housing if they can't afford to pay their rent. So I would acknowledge the immediate moment. There's a lot of effort at the national level that goes into expanding housing choice vouchers. That has been the most significant way we have been expanding access to affordable housing for the last several years. It relies on the private market and relies on there being housing available in the private market that people can afford with the amount of subsidy they get. So that sometimes doesn't work as well. There are some people who believe that we need to invest more in public housing. I know it has rightfully has some stigma associated with it, believe me. But there's some real issues with places like California or New York, the ones I mentioned in my presentation, where the income inequities are so great that people who have working class and even middle class jobs can't afford to pay rent or pay for housing in those areas. So one way to alter the balance is for the government to become much more involved in housing, and that would include different forms of public housing that hopefully we would do much better in a new generation of programs. There's also a lot of talk, obviously, and I know in California, and I'll leave it there, with zoning restrictions. Those have to change. There's limits on the building of multifamily housing, which is contributing to there being less units available, but also just making it difficult for Black people to find housing, quite frankly, because the reasons that those restrictions are there were to force housing segregation. So if we address the housing segregation issues, everybody can have more housing and housing costs would come down.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple things that were sort of implicit in the conversation we've been having today. One of which is, you know, how important tenant protections are to stemming homelessness. I think many people who don't have any experience with housing instability kind of see homelessness and sort of tenant protections as two separate issues, and don't understand how, oh, there's Josiah making an appearance. Don't understand, you know, like there's a reason people fall into homelessness because they lost their housing. And, you know, the stat, Joy, that you mentioned that stuck out to me about 40% of homeless families, 40% of them are Black, or 40?
Amongst Black people who are homeless, 40% are families with children.
Right. So, I mean, it is that, I mean, I'm taking away from that that's more of an economic challenge than it is something like, you know, the criminal justice system or a mental health system or a addiction issue. So if we could help protect people in the homes that they have, that feels like a very key element to solving the homelessness crisis, especially as we're facing a recession right now. We're at 12:45. I want to get to the participant Q&A. So I'm going to invite Megan to jump back in. Hello. It looks like there are a bunch of questions in the Q&A. So Megan Abel, our Director of Advocacy, wondering if you can surface some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of our audience members for submitting some amazing questions, and thanks in advance to our panelists for answering them with all of your expertise and wisdom, and sharing your personal experiences as well. We've got a lot of questions that are focused around what is the solution, right? We've kind of unpacked the problem here. And so I want to start first with Gina's question, which is, why isn't housing a first priority in the Bay Area or throughout the state? What are the barriers financially to speaking to this solution?
And barriers financially for individuals or government?
I take this question to mean systemically. So what are some of the policies that we would need to implement in order for housing to become more accessible to Black folks in our communities? And what are the barriers that the state has in getting towards those solutions?
John, since you're our resident Bay Area representative, I'm going to kick that question to you. What are the other campaigns or ideas that we're working on, and where do you see the big challenges to solving the housing crisis in the Bay Area?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And of course, everything starts with policy change, because that's the thing we got to focus on. We have to stay away from the tendency of just segmenting this and looking at this as individual tenant versus landlord relationships. So with that being said, the solution starts with, honestly, we have to educate ourselves on the history of these issues. Like, for example, here to the point about the Bay Area, in Oakland in particular, here's something I've always called out. Jerry Brown, 20 years ago, when he was the mayor of Oakland, he had what he called a 10K plan. The plan was to bring in 10,000 white affluent people into downtown Oakland. Downtown Oakland, the closest community is West Oakland, a historically Black community. This is when the police began to harass Black residents in West Oakland to make it more attractive for white people to come in. As a result of those activities, the Oakland Police Department has been under federal oversight for nearly 2 decades, costing taxpayers millions of dollars, not to mention millions of dollars spent settling police brutality lawsuits. Jerry Brown also did something. He instituted the first charter schools in Oakland. Now, people might say, why am I talking about the police and why am I talking about schools when we're talking about housing? It's all interconnected. OUSD is the second largest holder of public land in Oakland. So anytime the district is experiencing a financial impact, a financial crunch, there will always be a call for them to sell public land. The city of Oakland has been selling public land to private developers under the guise that if you build expensive units, people with money would choose to live there as opposed to living in low-income units. That doesn't work. That's Reaganomics, it's trickle down. So what we have to do is we have to look at the intersectionality of these issues, look at what's causing it, and then we're in a better position to implement some of the solutions. But to be quite honest, when we're talking about the Bay Area, right, we're dealing with an economy that isn't really rooted in helping people access housing as it once was. Oakland was a manufacturing-based economy to where you can, within walking distance of your job, buy a home. That doesn't exist today. We're more of a service-based economy. So we need something that's comprehensive. If we just segment housing from it, then we will be more reactive.
Lorraine, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what's going on in LA. Are there similar, I know that gentrification is an issue in LA, but do the pressures feel the same? And what are your priorities down there?
Again, it's the zoning, understanding how that is affecting the building of housing for the families. Again, I also want to echo like the intersectionality. There's this thing that I've been really thinking about around reparations. So understanding that way back in 1979, it was this proposed study for reparations, and it has never been put into action. And so it's again put out there for us to contact our Congress to tell them it's time to move that forward. Because when we think about the way that we have this accessibility to housing, Black people, right? People of color. And when folks are coming from this lens of we don't really trust them. Like if we gave them this reparations, what would they do with it? Where would they live? Like, would they just buy a bunch of shiny things? And it frustrates me when I think about it. Whenever I speak about reparations, and even people of color, how they've been conditioned to function in such a way that's under this structural racism system, they aren't very sure of like what would they do. But I'm most definitely sure that if folks had the ease and the comfort of the finances, that they would secure themselves in a stable place of living. I'm most sure. Now, whatever that looks like, let folks, you know, have that creativity. Let them have that opportunity. Let them have the opportunity. That's one thing that we need to take a look at, is giving folks the opportunity to be able to have the space to say, I choose to live here, and this is what I'm going to do. And again, taking a look at the tax breaks that are on the wealth begets wealth, right? You get a second home, you get a vacation home, you get tax breaks. It doesn't work. There's so many different things that I take a look at on my journey. So understanding that I came from being on government assistance to now being fully self-sufficient, but I was $6 over the income bracket when they sent me a letter and said I was no longer eligible, but I was still in the poverty rate. And I still live in a community where we have these predator lenders that are just waiting for folks to fall into a financial crisis so you can get a loan from them, and they'll be taken from your pocket for the rest of your entire life.
Yeah. I mean, I am glad you brought up reparations. I think, you know, anyone who thinks it's a radical idea, in my mind, just hasn't read enough about history. And two books I want to recommend. One, which Joy, you mentioned earlier, Evicted, which is a really great sort of ground level look at homelessness, and not just housing instability, I would say, but also housing segregation. And then John, you were posting on Facebook the other day about The Color of Law, which is the best book I've read in the last 5 years about housing, that also really kind of lays this bare. And I think one thing I'm interested to see, I mean, obviously it's not that hard for the government to move money. We sent everybody, well, a lot of people $1,200 pretty easily. And I think it would be interesting to look at that, what the impacts of that money were and how people actually spent it, to really show that, you know, if you put this money into communities that need it, they're going to invest in a way that really strengthens not just the Black community, but the economy overall. So that's my little soapbox about reparations. John, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, real quick. I'd be remiss because this really answers the question you had. So there's three things we're working on. With two things, and third is key. The first is, and Megan was an instrumental part of this, we've been recognizing the need for anti-displacement efforts, right? Because we have a lot of conversation about building houses, right? We have to dismantle the pipeline that's leading to homelessness, right? The evictions, right? So we worked on anti-displacement, and just recently the Board of Supervisors approved additional funding, especially in light of COVID, because we know the moratoriums have a sunset. At some point it's going to end. So we want to make sure folks have access to the legal assistance to keep them in their home. The second thing is with the tenant protection ordinance, because we know that people have to reshuffle residentially, meaning move in with loved ones. And we know that landlords were preventing things like that. So for us, it's important to have a comprehensive approach, because sometimes we look too high level, we forget that there's other things that can help. Here's the third thing that's really key and needed. And this is actually worse than having a criminal record. It's an eviction. Oakland was experiencing upwards to 1,000 evictions per month. So we can build all the housing units we want. I don't know of a single landlord who will rent to someone with an eviction. And that is where the role of government must step in, because this balance, I end on this note, is so important with housing. I believe housing should be regulated as a monopoly, similar to electricity, water, and gas. There's a reason why we don't subject fire services to the open market. We tried that before, it was inefficient. When we're keeping housing the way it is, we're always going to have these issues that pop up. So to me, that is really the key, because the government can not only build the housing, the government can waive those barriers. The government can say it don't matter if you have an eviction or a criminal record. It's kind of difficult to force landlords beyond a certain point when we're talking about property rights. So thank you for giving me that chance to share that.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left, but I want to try to get a couple more questions in. So Megan, do you want to read just 2 or 3 questions and then the panelists can decide how they want to answer?
Yeah, this question comes from another Gina. The first was also named Gina, but this one is Tech Equity Collaborative member Gina, who we know very well, who's asking what efforts are underway to ensure the homeless community is counted and represented in the critical 2020 census. The results of such are critical to ensure ongoing services. Maybe a good question for Joy. And then another question that came up from Doris is, to learn more about the next steps in the Fair Chance Housing campaign, where this is headed after it's passed in Berkeley and in Oakland. And then the final question that I have is from Eli. What are the most powerful actions individuals with stable housing and or excess income can take to fight against the oncoming wave of evictions due to COVID? So,
okay, so
free for all.
quick answers. Joy, do you know much about the homeless count in the census?
So we've been trying to learn more about it, to be honest. They do typically go to communities. They usually have an easier time of counting people who are sheltered than unsheltered. I think they were going to try to do a little bit more to improve this year, but recently the president announced that he was moving up the deadline for the census count, which is clearly going to impact the census's ability to reach homeless people and other people who tend to be more difficult to reach, which are lower income folks and people of color. So yeah, I'm not going to say anything about that, but there are people who think about it. I don't think we'll see as many improvements this time around as we had hoped.
John, can you speak to next steps on the Fair Chance Housing campaign?
Yes, real quick. Yeah, I'll be real quick. We're currently seeking passage in the city of Emeryville and Alameda County. Next would be the cities of Stockton and Los Angeles, and then ultimately statewide.
Yeah, we were really excited about running a statewide campaign on this issue as early as 2021. Lorraine, can I go to you on, for just to close this out here, for folks who are, more privileged and don't have any experience with housing instability, what's the best advice you can get for how they can be good allies and support the issues that you're talking about?
Yeah, there's been talk about these community investment pools that allows for community members to have access to the funds without having to have these barriers or like these kind of like filters that they have to go through to get them, that they just get to them because we trust that people need and that people will do what it takes to meet their needs. So expanding your level of trust, investing in community investment pools, that's something doable.
That's a great one. The other thing you can do, if you work in tech, you can join Tech Equity, become a member to really help us bring your voice to the table. As John mentioned earlier, it actually really does make a big difference to winning these campaigns when policymakers see that it's supported by a wide range of residents. And tech workers really have a lot of civic power to bring to bear on these issues. So we're representing your voice on these issues every day. We helped pass the Fair Chance Housing campaign. We helped pass the Tenant Protection Act of 2019 in California. And we will continue to do that work. So if you work in tech, please join Tech Equity. It's $10 a month, less than Netflix, and I think arguably more valuable than Netflix. And continue to join us on our webinars. We do these at least twice a month, and we're launching, I don't know if you've heard, but there's an election in November. We're launching an election series so you can learn about what's on the ballot. That isn't about the presidential, but what's happening on the ground here in California, issues that are extremely critical to addressing the equity issues that we've been talking about today. So I'll be getting a follow-up email with some things you can do in the short term, some resources from our panelists, and more information about follow-up events. And I want to thank Lorraine and Joy and John for joining us, spending an hour with us today. Really appreciate you all sharing, and looking forward to seeing you all soon. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye, Jaya.